4,4,5-T was the main ingredient in Agent Orange, the defoliant used by the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War. During the war, 40 million liters of Agent Orange, containing 400 kilograms of pure dioxin, were sprayed on trees in southern Vietnam. 3 million people were contaminated, including thousands of American soldiers. Even some 40 years after the end of the war, dioxin continues to claim more victims. We know today that this poison provokes cancer and serious genetic malfunctions.
I don't know about you, but when I think about Monsanto, the first thing that comes to mind is food safety enemy number one. After all, I'm talking about a company that went from producing cancerous gems like DDT, PCBs, and Agent Orange to genetically re-engineering a staggering portion of the food we eat here in the U.S. Just to give you a sense of how monopolistic this industry has become, consider this. 40% of the world's GM crops are grown in the U.S., where Monsanto alone controls 80% of the corn and 93% of the soy. Corn and soy make up the base of almost every processed food item in this country. Interestingly enough, America is unique in its production and consumption of GMOs. Every other industrialized country has either completely banned or at the very least labeled GM products. Why? Because these countries have recognized the risks associated with them. Most recently, a French scientist concluded that GM corn leads to tumors in rats. So, with this knowledge, why is the U.S. government giving Monsanto a blessing of deregulation? And not just a blessing to sell their products, but to sell them with a guarantee that consumers have no idea what they're actually eating. So the answer is simple. The government has no shame when it comes to the revolving door policy between private industry and regulation. It all started when George Bush Sr. deemed GM crops as substantially equivalent to non-GM crops. After that declaration was made, the floodgates opened and saturated the market with untested food products. This policy continues today because of the dozens of U.S. government employees that have a personal stake in ensuring that Monsanto meets its bottom line. Take, for example, former Democratic Congressman Toby Moffett. This Connecticut lawmaker worked in Congress for 8 years before he became a lobbyist for Monsanto. Or, think that's a conflict of interest? How about the career history of Margaret Miller? She originally worked as a researcher on bovine growth hormone, or BGH, for Monsanto, and now she publishes research papers on BGH for the FDA. And get this, her research was backed by Michael Taylor, the current Deputy Commissioner for Policy at the FDA. This guy epitomizes the revolving door. First, Taylor was a lawyer for Monsanto. Then he joined the FDA's Deputy Commissioner for Foods. Then he went back to Monsanto and became its Vice President for Public Policy. Yeah, I'm sure his FDA position didn't help open that door. But don't worry, he's now back in the FDA in the same cushy position as he was before, rubber stamping pro-Monsanto legislation. And he's not alone. Take Marcia Hale and Josh King, who left their jobs at the White House for lobbying positions at Monsanto. Meanwhile, Virginia Weldon and Lydia Watford ditched their positions at the chemical giant for 2 job openings at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. I mean, really? You think that there was an underground tunnel between the White House and Monsanto? Even the kings and queens in the highest court of the land have ties to the mega corporation. Clarence Thomas used to be an attorney for the ag giant, and now he sits as Justice of the Supreme Court. But you know, if there's one person you can thank for it all, it's Mr. Roger Beachy. Beachy's research for Monsanto led to the world's first genetically modified crop. So, knowing all of this, is it any wonder why Congress snuck in an extension to the Monsanto Protection Act in the latest spending bill? And this has been your revolving door alert of congressional sellouts, as always, sponsored by Monsanto.
Exceptional news footage actually shows George Bush Sr. visiting Monsanto's research facility 9 years before Roundup-ready soybeans were first sold.
What I'd like to do today is show you some of the steps we go through when we're moving genes from one organism into another. And you'll actually be doing the very little manipulations we do in the laboratory, where we take DNA, cut it apart, mix different pieces together, and then rejoin them, splice them back together. This tube contains DNA that was made from a bacterium. DNA would look the same whether it was from a plant or an animal. What are we saying here?
Oh, I see. And this will lead you to do what? To have a stronger plant, or a plant that's resists
herbicide? In this case, it resists the herbicide.
I see.
We have fabulous herbicide.
This is a chemical that will...
When George Bush Sr. toured the company's headquarters, he was Ronald Reagan's vice president, and deregulation was this Republican administration's watchword. The intention was to boost industry by eliminating what White House hardliners called bureaucratic hurdles, like health and environmental safety testing, which were Monsanto's key problems.
We have before USDA right now a request to test this for the first time on a farm in Illinois this year. And
Get hallucinating about it, we'll lose it everything.
yes, we will.
And then the expense goes out and nothing happens because you can't.
Yeah, and I would say, quite frankly, we have no complaint about the way USDA is handling it. They're going through an orderly process. They're making sure that as they deal with these new things, they do them properly. And no, if we're waiting until September and we don't have our authorization, we may say something different.
Oh, man, we're in a dereg.
In 1988, when George Bush Sr. was elected President of the United States, Dan Quayle became the new Vice President. 4 years later, he announced the American policy concerning GMOs, drafted just as Monsanto had wanted.
We are taking this step as part of the President's Regulatory Relief Initiative, now in its second phase. The United States is already the world leader in biotechnology, and we want to keep it that way. In 1991 alone, it was a $4 billion industry. It should reach at least $50 billion by the year 2000, as long as we resist the spread of unnecessary regulation.
In a nutshell, in the United States, the Secretary of Agriculture doesn't stand a chance against the multinationals. But just how are GMOs regulated in the United States? The most crucial policy on this subject was published by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which is legally responsible for regulating the safety of food and medicine. Title: Foods derived from new plant varieties. Date: May 29, 1992. Principle 1. Foods derived from genetic modification are regulated within the existing framework that applied to foods developed by traditional plant breeding. Obviously, the FDA decided not to create a special category for GMOs. For further information, contact James Mariansky, who headed the biotechnology department at the time.
Basically, the government had taken a decision that it would not create new laws, that it felt there were already sufficient laws in place that had enough authority for the agencies to deal with new technologies.
To write a policy where GMO should not be submitted to a specific regulatory regime, but it's not based on scientific data. It's a political decision?
Yes, it was a political decision. It was a very broad decision that didn't apply to just foods. It applied to all products of biotechnology.
Unbelievable. James Mariansky admits that GMO regulation was based on politics rather than science. How exactly did they justify their decision? Principle 2. The components of food as a result of genetic modification of a plant will be the same as or substantially similar to substances commonly found in food. In other words, the FDA considers that a genetically modified plant is equivalent to its conventional counterpart. What they call the principle of substantial equivalence has been adopted around the world, and it's at the heart of the debate between biotech supporters and GMO foes.
How could the FDA decide that a GMO crop is the same as a conventional plant?
What we do know is that the genes that are being introduced currently, to date, using biotechnology, produce proteins that are very similar to proteins that we've consumed for many centuries.
That's the FDA's official position on the matter, which was toppled by Jeffrey Smith, author of several books on GMOs. Michael Hansen, scientific expert for the Consumers Union of the United States. And writer Jeremy Rifkin, who was the first to denounce the principle of substantial equivalence.
The reason why GM crops are here is based on a deception that occurred in the FDA. They said that these foods are not different. They use the word substantially equivalent. They use the word not meaningfully or uniformly different. And what that turned into was a terminology called generally recognized as safe, or GRAS. Typically, if something is to be considered generally recognized as safe, it needs lots of peer-reviewed published studies and an overwhelming consensus among the scientific community. With GM crops, they had neither.
What FDA was saying was if you introduce a gene into a plant, that gene is DNA, and we've consumed DNA. We have a long history of consuming DNA, and we can establish that that is GRAS.
We were trying to say that these things should be considered food additives. When you want to put a new coloring agent in a food, the tiniest bit of coloring agent or a preservative or some other tiny chemical, that's considered a food additive, and you have to go through all these procedures to show that it meets the criterion of reasonable certainty of no harm. But when you genetically engineer a food which can cause untold differences in that plant, they don't require anything.
Here in Washington, if you were to have an evening and go out and get a drink at one of the local haunts where all the lobbyists hang out, everybody would laugh about this. They all know this was a joke, this substantial equivalency. This was simply a way to paper over the need for these companies, especially Monsanto, to move their products into the environment quickly with the least amount of government interference. And I should say they were very, very good at getting their interest expressed.
I remember meetings that we had where the Monsanto scientists met with the FDA scientists, and they went through the kinds of modifications that they were making and how those were being done. And basically what they were also saying to FDA is, how will these products be regulated?
I have never seen a situation where one company could have so much overwhelming influence at the highest levels of regulatory decision-making as the example of Monsanto with its GM food policy in the government.
French Prime Minister Jean-Marc Ayrault says he's prepared to call for a wider European ban on genetically modified produce following an alarming new study that throws the safety of the food into doubt. The report claimed that 200 rats fed GM corn produced by US firm Monsanto had suffered tumours as big as ping-pong balls. Ayrault has ordered that the scientific validity of the study be checked by the country's health watchdog. So far, Monsanto has not responded to the findings. But scientist Joel Spiro has called for new rules on GM foods.
A court in the French city of Lyon has ruled US pesticides maker Monsanto was responsible for the poisoning of a farmer who'd used one of their products on his crops. Paul Francois says he suffered neurological problems including memory loss, headaches and stammering after inhaling Monsanto's Lasso weed killer in 2004. His lawyer described the ruling as historic. The tribunal has ordered an expert opinion, so we'll see what comes out of that in relation to compensation.
In an unmarked grave some 2 miles from where he lived, Daulat Tekam was laid to rest. He added 1 to a grim tally. Here in the Vidarbha region of central India, some 1,300 cotton farmers took their own lives in 2006.
Besides monsoons and markets, farmers face another problem, Monsanto, according to Vandana Shiva. She's a nuclear scientist who became an anti-globalization activist 20 years ago.
Every seed that is in the market in cotton today is linked to one company or the other, licensed and controlled by Monsanto.
She says peasant farmers used to use natural fertilizers and pesticides, and they grew and saved their own seeds to plant the next year's crop. In the 70s, coaxed by the government and international aid donors, farmers began to use hybrid seeds bought in the store. These offered the promise of better yields and disease resistance, but they can require careful management, including chemical fertilizer and pesticides. More recently, genetically modified Bt cotton seeds were introduced by St. Louis-based Monsanto, licensed and sold under the names of well-known Indian seed companies. Bt seeds are patented, so farmers aren't allowed to grow and replant them. They must be bought every year from the seed companies, which market them with film stars and even Hindu deities, says Vandana Shiva.
They keep saying this is red disease, red disease. I really don't know why this is happening.
Mandre is learning that his new crop is not as disease-resistant as the ad said. His is the classic saga in which many illiterate farmers eventually lose their land, says Vandana Shiva.
That innocent farmer is grabbed by the agent who says, here's a miracle seed, it's going to double your income, you're going to be a millionaire, put your thumbprint out here. The farmer has no idea what he's signing on to. The farmer has no idea that 2 weeks down the line he'll have to come back for pesticide. That when the leaves will start shriveling up, the agent will say, no, you also needed irrigation, we didn't tell that to you in the beginning, so take a tube well loan, and here's another loan.
The Monsanto company declined our requests for an interview. It did issue a statement that in part reads, while some may suggest that BT cotton is to blame, the fact is that there are multiple social, economic, and environmental factors that make agriculture challenging in India.
Next, we do some internet research. We find more than 500,000 critical entries on the subject of risks. A frequent point of criticism, allergy dangers. Experts argue about whether sufficient testing on such risks has been done. Another discovery we made on the internet is this article by a Japanese professor. He criticizes the license papers of genetically modified soybeans. He found misinterpretations, false conclusions, and disregarded data. Serious accusations. A scientist from Caen in northern France mentions a further point. The animal tests done on the harmlessness of these genetically modified foods were inadequate. We want to get to the bottom of these three issues: allergy dangers, licensing procedures, and, here at the University of Caen, the quality of the animal feeding studies. The manufacturers of genetically modified foods want to prove the harmlessness of their products by feeding them to animals and obtaining good results. Professor Gilles-Éric Saralini, on the other hand, thinks these tests have been designed in a way that suggests they are meant to hide something. Their statistics are meaningless and they never should have been accepted. True results like this one are concealed through inadequate statistics.
Already in 90 days, there are toxicological problems with the rats eating that, and that means for consumer that they can have kidney and liver problems.
We would like to hear a reply to this argument from the world's largest producer of genetically modified food, Monsanto. They were the ones who did the tests. But our request for an interview was categorically refused. The next destination on our research trip is Japan.
It's a huge market for the genetic engineering industry. Monsanto pushed its way onto the market with genetically modified soy during the mid-90s. Every Japanese person eats soy, and Monsanto wants a piece of the pie. And this even though resistance in Japan to genetically modified food is especially high. The avalanche set off by environmental activist Makiko Irasawa was grist to the mill for the opponents of this technology.
I thought it was so strange. I thought, I'm the consumer. I should be the one to decide whether or not I want to eat genetically engineered foods. But I wasn't able to do that with genetically modified soy.
Ms. Irasawa wanted to know what she was actually eating. She went to the Department of Health, and to her surprise, she was allowed to look at the licensing papers for Monsanto's GM soy. This is not allowed elsewhere. The folders are kept in a simple metal cabinet. The unaltered originals mustn't be taken away or photocopied. They have to be copied out by hand. And that's just what Ms. Irasawa did. She and almost 100 helpers copied out nearly 1,000 pages. They noticed that there were serious discrepancies between the Japanese and the American versions. The Japanese one contained no reference, for example, to the weight changes experienced by the lab animals. What do such weight changes tell us? Makiko Irasawa isn't an expert, so she looked for someone who could scientifically evaluate the papers. She went to Masaharu Kawata, assistant professor of microbiology at the University of Nagoya. The same Professor Kawata whose internet texts had come to our attention. Professor Kawata promised us 3 examples to illustrate his criticism of Monsanto's soybeans.
Here we have the papers for the genetically modified soy. And right away we have the first problem. The artificially introduced gene, a protein, was not examined in the plant itself. Monsanto had this protein rebuilt by a bacterium in the laboratory. That is cheaper for Monsanto, but from a scientific point of view, the plant itself has to be examined. Because the protein in the soy and in the bacterium are not necessarily identical. Thus, this method cannot be used to exclude any health risks. And a second point of criticism. Monsanto only investigated a small fraction of the protein. Only the first 15 amino acids of the 455 the protein consists of were examined. The manufacturer cannot exclude allergy risks or even toxicities. I think it is likely Monsanto wanted to hide possible changes and thus possible dangers. This test here is very important. Soy is cooked because only cooked soy is palatable. If this cooking test fails, people's health is at risk. Monsanto conducted the following standard test. Boil once at 100 degrees for 10 minutes. Now the harmful proteins should be destroyed, but they weren't. What did they do then? They just repeated the test, again for 10 minutes at 100 degrees. The protein still wasn't destroyed. Then they boiled the genetically modified soy for a whole 25 minutes, this time at 220 degrees. That's what the papers say. The problem is obvious. No one preparing soy in the home cooks it at 220 degrees, and for half an hour at that. Genetically modified soy should not have been approved. It is probable that the genetic modification made the protein more stable. It just isn't destroyed. For me, this failed cooking test, it says here in the papers how they did it, has a direct connection to the increased number of allergies. Monsanto's conclusion that genetically modified soy is safe is wrong, probably even criminal.
A serious allegation by the professor. What does Monsanto say about this? They continue to deny our request for an interview.
Any scientist that looks into the research or the lack of research on the safety of genetically engineered food comes to the conclusion that these foods should not be on the market. They need another decade or 2 of research.
Monsanto is the company that told us that PCBs were safe. They were convicted of actually poisoning people in their town next to the PCB factory and fined $700 million. Genetic engineering is a process where scientists take genes from one species and force it into the DNA of other species.
Every single independent study conducted on the impact of genetically modified food shows that it damages organs, it causes infertility, it causes immune system failure, it causes holes in the GI tract, it causes multiple organ system failure.
The whole concept of genetically modified organisms is throwing a monkey wrench in the life on this planet.
What if we could produce more yield on the same amount of land, squeeze more water from a single raindrop, conserve natural resources while caring for the environment?
Monsanto is the company that told us that PCBs were safe. They told us that Agent Orange was safe. They told us that DDT was safe, and now they're in charge of telling us if their own genetically modified foods are safe.
The reason why we have 170 million acres of genetically engineered corn and soybeans and cotton and canola oil and sugar beets in the United States is because it doesn't have to be labeled.
The first genetically modified animal, a salmon, may soon be approved for human consumption.
Both these fish are 18 months old, but the larger genetically engineered Aqua Advantage salmon grows twice as fast as the regular salmon.
There has not been sufficient animal health testing, human health testing, or environmental impact testing of these new transgenic fish.
Basically, they've taken agriculture and built an industrial model which doesn't fit nature. So instead of changing their agricultural model to accommodate what is natural, they're changing nature to accommodate the industrial model. If you have an organic corn crop that sits next to a genetically engineered corn field, and it happens to tassel at the same time, and it happens to be downwind, you're going to get your crop contaminated.
The rest of the food supply is contaminated. Then the genie is out of the bottle, and it's maybe physically impossible to turn the situation around.
In the genetic engineering revolution, these seeds are now patented property of one corporation called Monsanto.
The pharmaceutical industry has no interest in having you well because they don't make any money if you're well. And the pharmaceutical industry is the biotech industry.
Some people think that GMO really means God move over.
We are heading downhill at a rapid rate of speed toward our own extinction.
The use of GM in agriculture is a risk that is simply not worth taking.
They told us that Agent Orange was safe. They told us that DDT was safe, and now they're in charge of telling us if their own genetically modified foods are safe. Because the FDA doesn't require a single safety study, they leave it to Monsanto.
I know Monsanto, as one of the officials of the organization said, we're here to make money. And that's not just Monsanto, that's a lot of food industries. Their job is to make money for the investor. Unfortunately, that becomes the highest priority thought in their minds. Make money, make money, make money. They're not actually making products to make health, they're making money.
Why did the FDA abdicate their responsibility to protect us? The White House had instructed the FDA to promote biotechnology under the first Bush administration. And so the FDA created a new position for Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney. So Michael Taylor was in charge of policy at the FDA when this GMO policy was created, and then he became Monsanto's vice president, and under the Obama administration was put back in the FDA as the U.S. food safety czar. In reality, the overwhelming consensus among the scientists at the FDA were not only that GMOs were different, but that they were inherently dangerous, that they might create allergies, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems. They had urged their superiors to require long-term study, and when they saw drafts of the policy coming back to them, they were angry and urged their political appointees to change course. But Michael Taylor and the political appointees ignored the science, ignored the scientists, denied the existence of their concerns, and set forth a policy that allowed GMOs to be put on the market in a way that creates unprecedented risk for human beings and the environment.
The FDA is composed of smart people, but they're smart people with a conflict of interest. They're smart people who make their decisions based on what will support their financial needs or their academic needs, not what makes scientific sense.
What you can do with GMOs is basically engineer food in ways that make it most profitable from the company's perspective. But from the company's perspective, whatever negative aspects of that might exist are simply irrelevant. And more than being irrelevant, the company is motivated to try to suppress knowledge about those negative aspects. The company is motivated to try to suppress government attempts to regulate in relation to those negative aspects. The company is motivated to try to infiltrate government and lobby government. I mean, when you look at the Clinton administration, Bush Sr., Bush Jr., and Obama, you look at various high-ranking positions in the administrations of all of those presidents, you find people who have worked for Monsanto.
Most people don't realize that Monsanto has been around for about a century. They've acquired lots of resources, and they are very clever and sophisticated. They know how the game works. They understand lobbying. They understand bribery. They have been effective at essentially stacking the political structure, the federal regulatory agencies in their favor, to the point that it's almost physically impossible to pass any type of federal regulations or legislation because the people who make those choices have been in the revolving door of Monsanto. They either previously worked for them or they're paid consultants for them.
The governments now, wherever they are dependent on corporations. Who are these governments? Who are these companies, corporations, telling people what to do, what to eat, what to feed their children? We are people, we're the children of God. We have constitution, we have our constitutional rights to eat and feed our families that nature produces. They say, no, we don't have that right. In fact, we're going to force that on you.
It's the FDA and the USDA who helped lead the charge for these new food safety bills. There's nothing in those bills to protect you. It's there to protect the genetic engineering industry. And unfortunately, if we don't stop this, you won't see organic farmers. The laws in the bills currently are so strict, so arbitrary, that if you are a small organic farmer, you can't meet their requirements for safety. As a result, you'll go out of business.
Not a single human being on earth gets up and says, boy, I can't wait to go to the supermarket and buy a GMO food. And why is that? That's because after 30 years and hundreds of billions of dollars of public and private investment, they haven't been able to come up with one thing in this food that actually helps the consumer. No better taste, no lower price, no more nutrition, nothing. Zip, zero, nada. 85% of all the genetically engineered crops in this country and around the world are designed so you can soak them with weed killers, toxic herbicides. And who are the big companies that do this? Come on, you know who they are. Monsanto, anybody, what? Who else? DuPont, Dow Chemical, Syngenta, Bayer. What kind of companies are these? Chemical companies.
As the chemical seed package has spread, and now with genetically engineered seed that originally was free in India because it belonged to the farmers, or was low cost because it was released from the public sector universities that did seed breeding. In the genetic engineering revolution, these seeds are now patented property of one corporation called Monsanto.
They take genetic material, either DNA or RNA, and insert it using very sophisticated techniques and create an artificial life form, a transgenic species that is impossible to reproduce in nature because the reproductive organs don't match. And as a result, once this form is created, here's the danger. It can cross-pollinate, it can contaminate the traditional crops.
Percy Schmeiser was a farmer in Canada who was contaminated by Monsanto's genetically modified seed. Well, he realized he'd been contaminated because he used some of this herbicide to kill off weeds around utility poles on his property. When he saw some of the seed did not die from the application of glyphosate, he knew it must be genetically modified. Well, he didn't do anything to purge his property of that contaminated seed. It would actually take 3 years of taking your crops out of use before you...
In 1992, the Food and Drug Administration decided that genetically modified organisms were the functional equivalent of conventional foods. They arrived at this decision without testing GMOs for allergenicity, toxicity, antibiotic resistance, and functional characteristics. As a result, hundreds of millions of acres of GMO crops were planted in America without the knowledge or consent of the American people. No safety testing, no long-term health studies. The FDA has received over 1 million comments from citizens demanding labeling of GMOs. 90% of Americans agree. So why no labeling? I'll give you one reason. The influence and the corruption of the political process by Monsanto. Monsanto's been a prime mover in GMO technology, a multi-million-dollar GMO lobby here, and a major political contributor. There is a chance that Monsanto's grip will be broken in California, where a GMO labeling initiative is on the ballot. And here in Congress, my legislation, H.R. 3553, will provide for a national labeling bill. Americans have a right to know if their food is genetically engineered.
In an unusually blunt letter, a group of federal scientists is complaining to the Obama transition team of widespread managerial misconduct in a division of the Food and Drug Administration. The letter from the agency's Center for Devices and Radiological Health said, quote, "The purpose of this letter is to inform you that the scientific review process for medical devices at the FDA has been corrupted and distorted by current FDA managers, thereby placing the American people at risk." The center is responsible for medical devices ranging from stents and breast implants to MRIs and other imaging machinery. The FDA dissidents allege that the agency managers used intimidation to squelch scientific debate, leading to the approval of medical devices whose effectiveness is questionable and which may not be entirely safe. They say managers with irrelevant scientific and clinical expertise and devices have ignored serious safety and effectiveness concerns of FDA experts and have ordered, intimidated, and coerced FDA experts to modify scientific evaluations, conclusions, and recommendations in violation of the laws, rules, and regulations, and to accept clinical and technical data that is not scientifically valid. A spokeswoman said the Obama transition team had no comment.
It's time to highlight the need for greater transparency and openness so voters can hold their elected leaders accountable and for what happens here in Washington, D.C., and to just know what's going on. The second provision, sent over from the House, tells the USDA to ignore any judicial ruling regarding the planting of genetically modified crops. Its supporters are calling it farmer assurance provision, but all it really assures is a lack of corporate liability. The provision says that when a judge finds that the USDA approved a crop illegally, the department must reapprove the crop and allow it to continue to be planted, regardless of what the judge says. Now let's think about that. The United States Congress is telling the Agricultural Department that even if a court tells you that you've failed to follow the right process and tells you to start over, you must disregard the court's ruling and allow the crop to be planted anyway. Not only does this ignore the Constitution idea of separation of powers, but it also lets genetically modified crops take hold across this country, even when a judge finds it violates the law. Once again, agribusiness, multinational corporations putting farmers as serfs. It's a dangerous precedent. Mr. President, it will paralyze the USDA, putting the department in the middle of a battle between Congress and the courts. And the ultimate loser will be our family farmers going about their business and feeding America in the right way. Sunshine Week shouldn't be show and tell, Mr. President, and slipping corporate giveaways into a bill at the same time that we call for more open government is doubling down on the same policies that created the need for Sunshine Week in the first place. That's why I've introduced two amendments to remove these corporate welfare provisions from the bill. Montanans elected me to go to the Senate to do away with the shady backroom deals, to get rid of handouts to big corporations, and to make government work better. We still have many challenges in front of us. And I commend the leaders of the Appropriation Committee for their commitment to working together to bring us on a plan we can vote. But these two provisions undermine our good work to support family farm agriculture. These provisions are giveaways, pure and simple, and will be a boon worth millions of dollars to a handful of the biggest corporations in this country. They deserve no place in this bill. We simply have got to do a better job on both policy and process.
What is represented by this figure is that certain groups of rats, male and female, have ingested GMO corn. GMO corn with Roundup residue and Roundup on its own. Every time we go up a level, a rat dies. The limit is 10 due to the number of rats that constitute a group. The dotted line represents the females of the group who die but have a completely normal diet. Only 2 animals die spontaneously after 550 days. On the other hand, every female that has been fed on the GMO with Roundup or Roundup diet has died more frequently than the other rats. Some will challenge the relevance of such results, but what is undeniable is that in the group that has been exposed to the GMOs, there is a 600% increase or 6 times more deaths compared to the control group. As far as medicine or biology is concerned, there is no need for further testing.
An important fact is that all the studies carried out on the rats are done over a 3-month period. It so happens that none of the effects are visible until the 4th month. This is fundamental in understanding that studies conducted over a 3-month period are useless. This conclusion is easily understandable. It could be said that their only use is to soothe the consciences.
Every rat out of the 200 that were tested was dissected by Professor Seralini's team. They did this to discover exactly what had affected their organs. The purpose behind this was to identify the way each diet, GMO and Roundup on its own, had acted on the metabolism of each animal, focusing on the development rate of the tumors that, and this comes as no surprise, only start to manifest themselves after the initial 3-month period.
This figure represents the number of palpable tumors contracted by the animal during the experiment. Here we can see the rats subjected to GMOs compared to those with a regular diet. As you can see, very few males have contracted tumours. This is due to them being more resistant to the testing process. What these figures show are the large tumours. Each step up represents a large tumour which can measure 17 millimetres by 17 millimetres. For a rat, these measurements are colossal. It would equate to a tumour of this size if seen on a human being. It is enormous. After having studied these tumours, it can be said that 94% of them take effect in the mammary glands, which would equate to breast cancer in a woman. We are faced with renal tumours for the males, but not only, some males also suffer from mammary tumours. This points towards a hormonal effect that isn't affected by the dosage. 60% of breast cancer cases are caused by hormonal deficiencies.
Professor Seralini's study holds one last surprise for us, and this is a major one. Up until now, one could have thought that the main cause of death for the tested rats was coming from the pesticide added to the corn. But what the study highlighted, and this for the first time ever, is the fact that the transgenesis itself could have killed the rats. What this means is that just by interfering with the genome of the plant in order to modify it, we are faced with repercussions that no one could have anticipated. This is enough to make us reconsider all the scientific precepts that led to the creation of GMOs.
Roundup had never been tested separately. Whilst conducting cellular studies, we saw that the cells of the liver, embryos, kidneys, placenta and the umbilical cord died much faster, and so we could deduce that there was a toxic effect on the organism. What can be said is that there is an increase in deaths due to GMOs and Roundups. The biggest surprise came when we realized that GMOs without any Roundup residue were responsible for an increase in the death rate of females and of some males. This could be the result of the GMO gene that has been badly assimilated by the plant and that has therefore resulted in a negative effect or due to a secondary metabolical effect.
What that means is that we are dealing with a GMO in particular, a modification of a cereal or a GMO corn. With regard to the genes inserted in the corn to make it a GMO corn can result in different effects. It is not because a certain GMO has a particular effect that other GMOs will have an effect, but some may even have more of an impact.
What is alarming, this is the GMO that is being eaten by the Americans, but also the GMO that has been approved for importation by European agencies, including the French ones, and that obviously contaminates our food.
President Obama this week signed into law a bill that could have huge consequences on the future of food in the country. The Agricultural Appropriations Bill has been dubbed the Monsanto Protection Act by critics of the agricultural giant. And that's because a provision in the law protects genetically modified seed patents from litigation over health risks. So if you get sick, too bad, you can't take it to court. Since being signed into law Tuesday, more than 250,000 people have signed a petition to President Obama. It says the law, quote, is unnecessary and an unprecedented attack on U.S. judicial review. Congress should not be meddling with the judicial review process based solely on the special interest of a handful of companies. Beyond what's in the bill, critics are angry about how it was passed, snuck into a huge agricultural bill without review by a committee. The law only remains in effect for 6 months, but opponents say this is an example of giant corporations trumping the health and safety rights of the average Joe. And that's not the only food news turning stomachs. The FDA is on its way to approving so-called Frankenfish. RT's Margaret Howell has more.
A genetically modified fish with spare parts is inches away from our food supply chain. The FDA is giving General Electric the go-ahead on an application that's been pending now for 2 years. Just what is this so-called Frankenfish anyway? Well, it's the biotech industry's genetically engineered fish that grows twice that of the normal rate of a real fish.
Now on to the Monsanto Protection Act. You remember that, right? It's that provision that was quietly inserted into a spending bill last spring and then signed into a law that basically allows Monsanto and other biotech corporations to continue distributing their genetically modified seeds even after a court has ruled that they may not meet certain environmental tests. It basically makes the GMO seed industry exempt from the court system. Inserted into a short-term spending bill earlier this year, it expires when that spending bill expires too, which is at the end of this week, you know, when the government shuts down. Now, the House's spending bill passed last week, the one that defunded Obamacare, also included an extension of the Monsanto Protection Act. But the Senate, which is currently working on its own spending bill now, will not include an extension of the Monsanto Protection Act. That's according to Senate Appropriations Chairwoman Barbara Mikulski and Senator Mark Pryor.
The recent spending bill, which threatened a government shutdown, was signed into law last week, easing the minds of many Washington politicians. But lesser known as Section 735 of the bill, officially titled the Pharma Assurance Provision, but since nicknamed the Monsanto Rider or the Monsanto Protection Act. The provision protects large biotechnology companies like Monsanto from being taken to federal court should a genetically modified organism be discovered as being harmful to the consumer. Some congresspeople argue that the provision was a necessary concession in order to pass the spending bill to prevent a total shutdown of the federal government. But according to Colin O'Neill of the Center for Food Safety, this did not have to be the case.
You know, I think most Americans are really disappointed in the Senate. The Senate Democrats have traditionally been a backstop against dangerous policy riders like this. These are negotiations that are no doubt very complex and very heated, but the Senate has time and time again refuted the need to incorporate these types of backdoor riders in must-pass pieces of legislation. We're disappointed that this time they acquiesced to that industry demand.
Over 250,000 people have signed a petition demanding President Obama veto the Monsanto Protection Act.
Food advocacy groups are not the only ones upset. Civil rights organizations have also come out against the provision because of the secretive nature in which it was passed, having been slipped into the bill not long before it was signed into law.
The provision did not follow traditional ways and was not discussed or debated in the appropriate congressional committees beforehand.
Folks like the American Civil Liberties Union, who don't traditionally work on agriculture, are very concerned about the precedent it sets, particularly given the absence of necessary Senate jurisdictions like the Senate Committee on the Judiciary or the Senate Committee on Agriculture, who weren't involved in this process at all.
Mr. President, I'll immediately implement country of origin labeling because Americans should know where their food comes from. We'll let folks know whether their food has been genetically modified because Americans... We'll let folks know whether their food has been genetically modified.
You know, after the show, a lot of people said to me that's current, why don't you talk about genetically modified foods? Okay, you're right, we should talk about genetically modified foods. And again, this is a conspiracy of both parties. Obama said in 2007, we would label genetically modified. 9 out of 10 Americans would like foods to at least be labeled, so at least we know they're Franken-foods.
Why?
Okay, they can't. Why? Because it says it would hurt sales. So shut up and eat your fucking mutant chili.
It doesn't keep the federal government from banning these genetically modified foods. It just says that if there's a court challenge or an injunction on the selling of these genetically modified foods, the Department of Agriculture has to allow a company like Monsanto, if they want, to continue selling the genetically modified crop. Your aphid-repelling soybean, your meat carrot, your tomato that will throw itself at bad entertainment. Let's at least then hear some of Congress's no doubt robust discussion on this controversial amendment.
Critics are angry about how it was passed, snuck into a huge agricultural bill without review by a committee.
Wait, someone just attached this language protecting genetically modified food makers into a bigger unrelated bill. Like the same way if you wanted to buy particularly nasty porno, you might slip it under some, hey, let me get some Mountain Dew, and I want a few Funyuns, and let me have Farmer's Almanac, and what is that, a case of cat food? Throw that in there, and maybe just to throw everyone off the scent a little bit. What are those, Fleet's enemas? Yeah, give me 4 of those, and and before I go, just some protections for the agribusiness. Put it all in the bag. Yeah, let's go. There's 535 people in Congress. How do they even let something like this happen?
The law passed without most of Congress even knowing about it.
If only one lawmaker had called out the so-called Monsanto amendment publicly, brought it to the attention of the other lawmakers, say a senator from Montana, John Tester.
The second provision, sent over from the House, tells the USDA to ignore any judicial ruling regarding the planting of genetically modified crops. These provisions are giveaways, pure and simple. They deserve no place in this bill. We simply have got to do a better job on both policy and process.
Oh, I see the problem here. The other legislators didn't know about it because Senator Tester brought it up on the Senate floor. in front of all of them. Perhaps if he had written it in the memo field of a Monsanto lobbyist check, people would have seen it. So, anything else in this bill that nobody knew about? Anything else? Why couldn't anyone prevent these weird amendments from happening?
They said if they wanted to keep the government from shutting down, they needed to get this through. There was no taking it out.
Right, because this was a resolution that kept government funded for the next 6 months. It had to go through, yet for some reason, none of you thought to sneak in amendments for we need. Immigration reform, infrastructure repair, Sunday bar, anything.
The government is going to tell you what you could grow on your farm, how to grow it, but could they tell you how to grow your garden? Really? No big deal, or yet another sign the government really doesn't know its boundaries. A number of food safety bills are circulating in Congress now, and I've been a lot of phone calls on these to my radio program. This happened after the peanut scare. One of them threatens to wipe out small farmers, and you could even be in trouble for growing a tomato in your backyard.
A DeKalb County man will soon be in court for growing too many vegetables. County code enforcement officers say Steve Miller's organic operation was too big for his neighborhood zoning, and the zoning has changed, but the county is still prosecuting him. Channel 2's Tony Thomas live in Clarkston, where Miller is planning to fight back. Tony.
Linda, this is just part of more than 2 acres of land that Steve Miller grows his food on. He says at times through the year he has more than 24 vegetables growing here. Now, neighbors have started calling this ongoing battle Cabbagegate.
Topography is also nice because it's somewhat level.
Steve Miller loves to grow and talk about vegetables.
It's a passion that I have, and unfortunately the passion has gotten me into trouble, and I can't understand why.
Please. And who are you? Mary Oaks with the Southern Nevada Health District. And why are you here? That's all the information you need. I do have a personal life too.
I want you to say that the health district has told us that we can't serve meat from the farm, meat from any farm, unless it's been United States Department of Agriculture approved.
Right. I knew that.
And
the issue was that it came from across the border.
Across the border,
yeah. And because it was certified by Utah, we couldn't use it here. Because the stuff that was approved by the state of Nevada, we could use. It doesn't have to be USDA, it just has to be
Why
state.
couldn't you use the vegetables?
Because once they're cut,
they're biohazard materials.
Yes. And so, even though I boiled them,
and so they're forcing us to throw all the food away.
And pour bleach on it.
We can't feed it to our pigs because.
And we're not allowed to eat it.
And we're not allowed to eat it as private citizens. And we have to pour bleach on it. So.
Follow the the supposed health code requirements. I'm having to throw everything away and start cooking again.
Can you tell us more about that?
I want to be able to regain my composure before I say more about it.
Okay.
Okay, so you'll tell us if we're doing something wrong.
I'll end up signing off. Okay. And then you will be good and I'll be able to leave.
I really think it's appalling that we live in America and we can't make choices about the food that we're planning to eat.
Especially good food. Fresh, wholesome food.
Perfect food.
Yes.
And there's people starving in America and all over the world.
It's despicable with the feast that was prepared to have the order for not a valid reason for a certified chef to destroy all this food.
Exactly.
It's just an absolute shame, not because we're here, but because it's good quality food that has no reason to be destroyed.
It's alright for the USDA to let us all kill ourselves eating McDonald's, but this good wholesome stuff isn't alright. So, but that's such a terrible thing. We gotta do something about it.
What should we do?
Well, just collaborate like what we're doing now. Support your local farmers, and supporting local is where it's going to start, and then it'll spread. So.
we've been battling with our son since he was very little, just allergies and ticks and all kinds of issues. We thought he was allergic to milk, so we were force feeding him soy ice cream, soy milk. Finally, he was old enough, we thought we'll go get the allergy test, and he is severely allergic to corn and soy. Well, as we started, you start reading packages, everything is corn and soy based. So we were watching Netflix, and it said something about corn and the state of corn, so we watched it. I am so shocked that I've lived my whole life and not read a label ever. I would have never thought about organic or where my meat came from, and when I saw what the state of the meat that we're eating, and I believe this wholeheartedly, and I know he teases me lots, I have a theory about, there's so much depression, and our children are being, diagnosed as bipolar and all the medication they're being given. I honestly believe it's the state of the food and the meat.
Alex Jones here reporting for some Twilight Zone level news. I live miles from where this is happening. Rob Dew, reporter for Infowars.com, just called me about an hour ago. I went and looked it up. It's all true. There's big ranches right outside Austin in Bastrop County, Elgin, Texas. The government told them they were planting grass that was GMO. It produces its own cyanide. It's what they call pharmacological crops. Most of the corn we eat, bugs can't eat it or they die. But it's safe for us to eat, they claim.
World News with Diane Sawyer.
Good evening. Today, 3 big new studies were released, and all 3 had one worrying conclusion. Common pesticides in water and food on farms may be linked to a lower IQ in children. All 3 cite exposure while still in the womb. And one expert said to us today, these studies are an alarm that signals before now we have underestimated the risks. Jim Sciutto has been taking an in-depth look at the new evidence and what it means for us today. Jim, good evening.
Well, Diane, what struck me most about these studies, particularly as a father, is how many ways we're exposed to them in our own kitchens. They're on fruits and vegetables, in commonly used home gardening supplies. They've even been detected in drinking water supplies, and the studies found the effects on children can be devastating.
Really? At 7 years old, children are already full of big dreams.
What do you want to be when you grow up?
A judge, gymnastics teacher, a basketball player.
Often even more than you expect.
I will like to teach first grade and be a swim coach.
But these new studies show how some pesticides could someday bring those dreams down to earth. The studies by Columbia, Berkeley, and Mount Sinai measured commonly used pesticides in pregnant mothers, the first to study their effect in utero, and then 7 years later tested their children's IQs. They found that above average exposure to the pesticides was linked to a drop in their children's IQs by as much as 7 points.
One of my concerns is why we're not in a position to identify these kind of hazards earlier before we've already exposed a couple of generations of children.
The pesticides with a complicated name, organophosphates, are found in a whole range of simple everyday products. Fruits and vegetables, in pesticides used to control cockroaches in city apartments, and in home weed killers. They've also been detected in the drinking water supplies of several American cities. Some have since been banned, but are still detected in the environment. These studies are just the latest to find a link between pesticides and children's development. A 1998 University of Arizona study of children growing up near Mexican farms using the pesticides asked 4- and 5-year-olds to make simple drawings, a common measure of IQ. Here are the children who were not exposed and those who were. The difference is dramatic. Scientists call this another alert that more needs to be done to protect the most vulnerable from dangerous chemicals.
What I like is everybody wants to be more than one thing.
We just always want to be it so we can help people.
The best thing you could do at home, Diane, is to wash your fruits and vegetables and thoroughly, even using a brush like this. And we put a list up online, Diane, of the vegetables and the fruits you have to be most careful with.
All right, Jim, thank you. I want to bring in Dr. Richard Besser now because you've been tracking the pesticide issue for some time, Rich. What do you make of this?
Well, Diane, these 3 studies are concerning. There's a lot more work coming on this. But I think pregnant women really do need to do what they can to limit their exposure to pesticides. And as there are are concrete things they can do. As Jim was showing, washing, scrubbing your fruits and vegetables will help. You can peel them. That's very helpful. Discard the outer leaves of leafy vegetables because that's where the pesticides are going to cling. And for those things that you can't wash, that you can't peel, like berries, think about buying organic because those won't have the pesticides.
And you were saying even with meat?
That's right. For your meat, your poultry, your fish, take off the skin and trim the fat because that's where the pesticides will really concentrate.
Concentrates in the fat, right under the skin.
Yeah, if you take that fat off, that will help.
It's now that the government is holding meetings all over the country for making announcement, a debt waiver for 13 million farmers. The amount of the waiver, 10 billion euros, a measure long expected in the Vidarbha region, where more than 1,000 in-debt farmers commit suicide every year. In the villages, the dead are still mourned. A few days before this announcement, a member of this family swallowed some pesticides. It's the third suicide of the village. The government had already admitted the possibility of increasing the number of farmers concerned by these measures. In 10 years, almost 150,000 of them, all over India, have committed suicide.
Did you know for many years the American people have been eating cloned beef and pork, and now they're expanding out into other forms of meat? Let's look at salmon first. Major university studies conclusively have proven that the type of genetically modified salmon that is actually a cross species, they've mixed other animal genes in with it, that when this fish is introduced with wild natural salmon, within 40 generations, all of the natural salmon are extinct. And the FDA approved this. And they're going to allow it to be released into the wild. That isn't even a salmon. It is a cross-species chimera. It is a mixture like something out of the island of Dr. Moreau, something out of a nightmare. More than 85% of the corn now consumed in the United States, and it's also starting to trend that way in Europe and Canada, is genetically engineered. It grows its own pesticide within the corn kernels so that insects won't eat it. If the insects can't eat this and live, what do you think is going to happen when lab rats or humans eat it? We have literally hundreds of studies showing that not just Monsanto's, but other major GMO companies' corn, that's the majority of corn we're now eating today in the United States, has been linked to organ failure in lab animals. The studies also show massive increases in sterility in rats and guinea pigs that are fed not just GMO corn, but GMO cotton seeds. Studies in India, Germany, and the United States have conclusively shown that when they feed the cotton seeds left over from the cotton crop from these genetically modified varieties, that the cows are having miscarriages, they are having low birth weights, or in many cases, they're simply dying. And what is in most processed foods? Genetically modified cottonseed oil. Major studies are also showing that genetically engineered crops are killing honeybees and monarch butterflies. But they don't stop there. Now they claim they're coming out with a genetically engineered mosquito that's malaria-proof that they're going to release into the open biosphere. The very genetic code of the planet is being butchered in a hostile corporate takeover. Many years ago, an executive from Monsanto was quoted in National Geographic as saying that that is their program, that they want to basically have their crops and their organisms take over the entire biosphere of this planet. And the major genetic engineer companies have focused mainly on 8 major food crops. Now they're expanding out into hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other plants, literally changing the genetic code of the planet. This is a genetic dictatorship. This is genetic vandalism. And that's why the Rockefellers, the United Nations, and others have built these giant armored seed vaults all over the world, not just at the Arctic Circle. And they admit they're doing it in case all of this gets out of hand, that they'll have a type of Noah's Ark. So all these fake environmental groups, they never complain about this. They never talk about true environmental degradation. They want to put a tax on carbon dioxide that humans exhale, that plants respirate from and carry out photosynthesis with, as a way to shut down industrial society and control every facet of our lives. That's the big secret. This is a population reduction program. It is an epidemic. The sperm count has dropped in the Western world exponentially. Even the government has been predicting within another generation almost everyone is going to be sterile. This is the globalist religion. This is their philosophy. They want the planet for themselves. The UN has said that their stated plan is an 80% population reduction. You've heard Ted Turner call us useless eaters and feeders and say that 80% of us need to be killed. You've heard Prince Philip say he wants to come back as a virus to kill the majority of the world population. Dr. Eric Pianka, Peter Singer, it's all over the news where they tell us that we should only have one child because more than one is bad for the environment and that the recession is good for lowering our carbon footprint. This is the big secret. We live in a scientific dictatorship, and the United States and England are the epicenter of this, and it's expanding worldwide. Remember all the secret testing, all the secret sterilization that went on in the United States and Europe. Remember what Hitler did. He learned all of that from the eugenicist and the Rockefeller family in the United States. This is a culture of death being pushed on you and your family. And even if you think the world is overpopulated, you need to understand that you're being targeted by this as well. Targeted by design.
Let me help you understand the enemy. And let me assure you that absolutely nothing that I'm going to tell you is exaggerated, is interpolated, or is imagined. Everything I'm going to tell you is documented. And a great deal of it is documented on my website, which is www.healthfreedomusa, one word, healthfreedomusa.org. And so they created a trade commission. That's a very important pair of words, a trade commission called the Codex Alimentarius Commission. It is not a public health commission. It is not a consumer protection commission. It is a trade commission. Now, Codex Alimentarius Commission is administered by the World Health Organization, WHO, and the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. They fund Codex and they run it at the request of the UN. In 1994, Codex, with no notice here in this country whatsoever, declared nutrients, put on your intellectual seatbelts, declared nutrients to be toxins. They're poisons, dangerous industrial poisons. As poisons, we have to be protected from them. What we're talking about is waking up one morning and being very surprised to find that high-potency, therapeutically effective, clinically significant nutrients are now illegal in the way that heroin is illegal. Not available with a prescription, illegal. Every animal used for food on the planet, whether it has fins, feet, or feathers, every animal on the planet must be treated with subclinical antibiotics. Must be treated with subclinical antibiotics and must be treated with exogenous growth hormones. Codex requires, mandates that all food be irradiated unless it's eaten locally and raw. All food, including organic food, of course. So is it organic afterwards? Go to Codex Alimentarius, do a Google search, and look, there are drop-down menus at the top of the official Codex page. Look at the toxins and the veterinary chemicals and the levels that are set. They are terrifying. In 2001, 176 countries, including the United States, got together and they said there are 12 really bad organic chemicals. They're called POPs, persistent organic pollutants. There are a lot of them, but there are 12 that are so bad that nobody could disagree that those 12 pops had to be banned worldwide. Codex has brought back seven of the 9 forbidden pops that 176 countries banned worldwide. Dieldrin, aldrin, hexachlorobenzene. And the food that is imported from other countries that contains these substances cannot be stopped at our borders, because otherwise it would be, God forbid, a trade violation. That's how Codex works. In the WHO FAO projections, the epidemiological projections, they estimate, not I, they estimate, they're the experts, that just the vitamin and mineral guideline alone, when it goes into global implementation on December 31st, 2009, will result in a minimum of 3 billion, that's B, bad, big, billion deaths. 1 billion through simple starvation. Those folks who die are not particularly economically successful from the point of view of the corporations. But the next 2 billion, they will die from the preventable diseases of undernutrition. Who will live? Probably those people who are wealthy enough and powerful enough to have their own pushers of clean food and nutrients. That's who will live. You and I? Probably not. Our children? Probably not. Our grandchildren?
On leaving Microsoft, Bill Gates bought $23 million of Monsanto shares. Globally, he now promotes GMOs and a vaccines collection he calls the solution for the world. Gates has been recorded explaining this solution is actually to cut the world's population.
Now, the world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. The density in the poor areas is greater than they can grow the food. The benefits there in terms of reducing the population growth.
The only vaccines that reduce the population, notes the site Prison Planet, are ones that sterilize people. The BBC says his foundation's funding big sterilization programs such as this one that blasts men's scrotums with ultrasound to damage the sperm. Here Gates actually calls for the so-called death panels to decide whether folks should live or whether, as he puts it, they have no benefit whatsoever.
And a lack of willingness to say, you know, is spending $1 million on that last 3 months of life for that patient, would it be better to see which ones actually have no benefit whatsoever? But that's called the death panel. And you're not supposed to have that discussion.
Anthony Gates actually brags he's doing God's work. The boss of Goldman Sachs said exactly the same thing while sending millions into starvation. What the heck is going on?
His father was one of the main grandfathers of the whole entire eugenics movement here inside the United States. And it's still going strong today.
My dad was head of Planned Parenthood. And it was very controversial.
And Bill Gates is here once again pushing the GMOs and everything else that is also reducing the population, because that's what he says. If we do a good enough job with vaccinations and everything, we'll be able to reduce the population. The polio vaccines now are the #1 cause of polio. There's no question that Bill Gates is not doing God's work. And if he is doing God's work, I would ask, which God?
Yeah, how have we moved to open plans to take away our water, hoarding food, and population controls?
They speak to us as if we are peon peasants in medieval times, and they are the kings, queens, and nobles. Why did they target the low-income portions?
Yeah, May 25th, over 2 million people across 48 states and 6 continents marched against Monsanto. What do you make of the company refusing to talk to us because we covered the march?
They can't stand up to the facts. They wouldn't come on this show. I would love to debate a Monsanto employee and show them that email. I mean, what would they say? They have nothing. They go into these poor communities and then, of course, reduced yields. So what happens to these farmers? They end up killing themselves by drinking the biopesticides that Monsanto gave them. So every 30 minutes, while we've been talking, someone has killed themselves.
Execs now boast about infertility from GMOs, hoard food, and say water shouldn't be a human right. Monsanto has publicly stated it wants to control 100% of the world's food supply. The government isn't stopping them, so who will? This is The Truth Seeker.
In a shotgun shack, you may find yourself in another part of the world. You may find yourself behind the wheel of a large automobile. You may find yourself in a beautiful house with a beautiful wife. You may ask yourself, well, how did I get here? Letting the days go by, let the water hold me. Letting the days go by, water flowing under into the blue again. After the money's gone, once in a lifetime, water flowing underground. You may ask yourself, how do I work this? You may ask yourself, where is that large automobile? You may say to yourself, this is not my beautiful house. You may say to yourself, this is not my beautiful life. Letting the days go by, let the water.
We've got to stabilize the population. When I was born, there were
so what's wrong with the population? I mean,
with too many people. That's why we have global warming. We have global warming because too many people are using too much stuff. But if there were less people, they'd be using less stuff.
Mr. Turner, I was wondering if you think it's a good idea to reduce 90% of the population because we are being overpopulated by a lot of... 90%. 80? Prince Philip said 80, sir. I go with 85.
I think 2 billion is about right.
Right, me too. Thank you. Exactly.
My name is Mark Weisskopf. I'm Assistant Professor of Environmental Health and Epidemiology at the Harvard School of Public Health. And I'm the senior author on a recent paper in pediatrics on the association between organophosphate pesticides and ADHD in children. What we set out to do is to look at the association between organophosphate pesticide exposures and the risk of ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, in children. Neurodevelopmental effects of these pesticides have been suggested from other studies, but there are other studies that have targeted very particular populations, like children of agricultural workers or children in inner city buildings where there's a lot of pesticide used to control pests of different sorts. So we wanted to see whether this is something that actually applies more generally across the United States, and then what we indeed found was that the children that had the higher levels of these metabolites in their urine, the metabolites of the organophosphate pesticides, had a higher odds of having ADHD. The organophosphate pesticides were designed to kill things. That's how they work. And the nervous system is a target of these pesticides. So there's certainly reason to be concerned. We can't know for certain that this is happening from our study. Our study suggests that there's something that we need to follow up on strongly here, but we don't have conclusive evidence yet. We can't at this stage say avoid something entirely. In fact, we don't want to say that for fruits and vegetables. There are a lot of benefits, health benefits to eating fruits and vegetables. If parents are concerned still about the pesticides, certainly washing fruits and vegetables before eating them is quite important. And also, it's been shown that eating organically grown fruits and vegetables can definitely reduce one's exposure to pesticides.
Ron Poulenc to drink doses of the extremely toxic insecticide in the 1992 study. And in the year 2000, in my own home state of California, Lockheed Martin paid 100 people in California $1,000 to eat a dose of perchlorate every day for 6 months. Perchlorate damages thyroid function and can cause mental and physical developmental problems in fetuses and children at low levels and is linked to thyroid cancer. Well, it seems to me when the industry wants something, they get it from this administration. And this is yet another classic case in point. Now, in February of this year, EPA announced the proposal to develop a comprehensive plan for human testing of pesticides. Under this proposal, pesticide companies would be able to pay people to ingest pesticides. Not only is this proposal scientifically flawed, but it ignores the recommendations of the National Academy of Sciences, and more important, it is morally reprehensible. We as a nation and a world oppose testing toxics on people. intentionally exposing humans with pesticides offers no health benefits to the human subject, nor is it intended to improve human health. Further, the Nuremberg Code, which we adopted post-World War II, and you all remember at least reading about the Nazi experimentation on human beings, generally prohibits non-therapeutic testing. Often, human testing of pesticides violates the Helsinki Declaration of the World Medical Association. So that is why I, along with many of my colleagues, religious, medical, ethical, scientific, and public health organizations, oppose human testing of pesticides. And this is my own belief. If EPA can get away with testing babies, infants, then they can get away with anything when it comes to human testing of toxics. And that's why I think this proposal is alive.
In the U.S. alone, genetically modified canola, corn, cotton, and soybeans, which were non-existent in the 1980s, were grown on 3.7 million acres in 1996. That jumped to 100 million acres in 2003. In 1998, Mexico banned the planting of genetically engineered corn to protect their agricultural heritage.
In Mexico, there are literally hundreds of varieties of corn. Some of them are adapted to very wet climates, some to very dry climates. Some of them are resistant to certain specific pests. Some of them have different tastes. Some of them are good for doing popcorn that was invented by the Aztecs. Some varieties are good to make tortillas or to feed the cattle. There's a whole bunch of kinds of corn in Mexico.
Around 7,000 years ago, the people who lived in Mexico started domesticating maize, or corn, and an intimate relationship developed between humans and the plant. Corn is not only their food supply, it is also part of the culture.
In the mountains in Jalisco, the farmers plant on purpose their cornfields near areas where the wild corn grows, the teocintle. And the reason why they do that is because they know perfectly well that they get resistance to pests transferred from the wild strain into the cultivated strain.
We don't know which parts of that diversity are going to be useful, and we need to preserve them all. Now, most of the diversity for crops is contained within so-called land races. These are the plants that small farmers, generally in very diverse areas of the world, maintain in very small plots with selection for the very specific conditions of the plots, which might be certain altitude, frost or drought, or very specific conditions. That is really the basis of diversity that we are continuously tapping from to maintain our commercial production of crops, to feed the world, basically.
I think there are 3 or 4 applications for patents for tortillas. Like it was a new thing, like somebody had invented tortillas, which of course have existed for 3,000, 5,000 years, we don't know. First of all, some people will debate, and I think it is a worthwhile debate, if life should be patented at all. And that's a discussion that humanity as a species hasn't done properly. And it is a sort of pending homework, something we need to do.
By the year 2003, the U.S. had sold millions of pounds of GMO corn to Mexico for less than the cost of growing it. Around the world, resistance was mounting against the U.S. exported genetically modified crops. The loss of corn exports to Europe is worth around $300 million a year.
The FDA has not done its job to protect the American people, but we can see that it's incapable of doing so because of Monsanto's deep ties to the administration.
What's remarkable about this is that these are the scientists working inside FDA, and when the political appointees at the top of the agency said no testing, no labeling, they say in these documents, where is your science? Why didn't you listen to our science? So now that means that these foods have gone out without the testing, without saying, hey, listen, are these foods toxic? Are these foods causing new allergens? They're out there, they're in the fields, they're in our supermarkets, they're now going around the world without this testing being done, even though FDA's own scientists said these tests should have been done, they had to have been done if these foods were to be proved safe. Section of the FDA. This is really amazing. Here they say genetically modified plants can contain unexpected high concentrations of plant toxicants. In other words, the genetic engineering of these plants can take a safe food and make it toxic. Not only that, but on food allergens, they say that there can be novel allergens, that this genetic engineering of plants can create new allergens never seen before in our food. And that's, again, from the toxicology section of the FDA, their own scientists. This food is not safe. It needs to be looked at. But Monsanto didn't want that examination to happen. So it used its political influence to make sure that the FDA could not do its job. And so to this day, both the United States and people of the world do not know if these foods are safe because Monsanto was able to convince these political appointees not to do their job.
This is another issue we would have liked to confront Monsanto about, but they're standing by their decision. No interview. And what about the FDA? A court ruled that the authorities' work was clean and independent. But for Andrew Kimbrell, there is a small clique of politicians, agency managers and Monsanto. To prove it, he shows us this diagram.
Look at this. Look at all these former Monsanto employees. Look at all the various government agencies that they have invaded. This is nothing less than a corporate coup d'etat. This is a corporate takeover of our government agencies by Monsanto. Look at this. This is John Ashcroft, formerly Attorney General and the current president. He had got more money from Monsanto, 5 times more money than any of the other hundreds of members of Congress that they found. He then got this man appointed to the Supreme Court. This is Clarence Thomas, a former lawyer from Monsanto, who recently authored, he was the author of an opinion that said, yes, Monsanto and DuPont, you can patent plants.
The next morning we meet a farmer who cultivates GM crops. He only wants to be filmed from behind. He doesn't want to be the black sheep of the community, only because he was willing to speak to us about the negative aspects of cultivating GM soy. But there are plenty of negative aspects to talk about. He shows us what the soil looks like where GM soy is cultivated. Grey and dead from the use of the special herbicides. They kill every plant except the soy. But now some weeds are becoming resistant.
What are the future consequences for our present actions? For years, the agriculture giant Monsanto has been genetically modifying corn and soybeans to withstand and even produce herbicides and pesticides. But as with what happened with drug-resistant bugs in modern medicine, and as Einstein so eloquently put it, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. This time it's in the form of superweeds and even more dauntingly, superworms. The Environmental Protection Agency has launched an investigation to inspect the resistance that is developing in parts of the Corn Belt and the unexpected colony of superworms that are bound to spread throughout the entire Midwest.
They just approved Roundup-ready alfalfa, genetically engineered alfalfa, engineered not to die when sprayed with Roundup. This is a catastrophe. Roundup-ready crops are already the most popular crops, the biggest acreage of crops that are genetically engineered. So millions and millions of pounds of Roundup is sprayed now. which is causing a catastrophe because it pulls nutrients out of the food supply. It promotes diseases in the soil. It's linked to endocrine disruption, to birth defects, to possible cancer. So the use of Roundup is now going to skyrocket because of the approval of Roundup Ready alfalfa. We didn't need it. Alfalfa is not generally sprayed with weed killer anyway. In fact, 93% of all the acreage of alfalfa is not sprayed with weed killer. So why did the USDA approve Roundup Ready alfalfa? Because of influence by Monsanto, not because of science, not because of what we want. So we need to ask our food companies, don't use any products from animals that have been fed GM alfalfa. Let's kick it out of the market.
In the summer of 2000, my family and I were discussing how rude we thought it was that Monsanto never sent us a letter or thanked us for cooperating with their investigation into our business. We were stunned when in late July of the year 2000, we received a letter from a law firm in New Orleans that was representing Monsanto Company, accusing us of infringing on their patent. Every accused grower in the United States that I have talked to had nearly identical stories. They come and test your crop. The farmers that have nothing to hide figure, well, they'll find that we didn't plant this crop that they say, and they come back over a year later and accuse you of this when the farmer can't go back and take crop samples and disprove them. Monsanto had told us that they had sampled all 3,850 acres of our soybean crop. The samplers would have had to have been gathering one sample continuously every 20 seconds. After examining the testimony that we gave, realized their story didn't add up. Now they changed their story, saying they only took a handful of samples per field. Are we to assume that they were lying in their first attempt to extort money from us, or are they lying now?
Estimates are that Monsanto has sent out 9,000 letters to farmers. Most farmers choose to pay to avoid lawsuits. Even so, there are 100 active lawsuits in the United States alone. When the farmers do settle with Monsanto, they have to agree to never discuss their settlement.
We feel that we were profiled by Monsanto because of the size of our farm, and that they wanted to try to make an example out of us to scare other farmers into never saving their own seed, to be too scared to save their own seed. Monsanto employees and government regulatory agency employees are the same people. And to give you one example, there's countless names on this list, but one that kind of stands out to me, the biggest, is Linda Fisher. Linda Fisher, for the past 7 years, has been an executive vice president for Monsanto Corporation. She is now the deputy minister for the EPA, also as a deputy minister under George Bush Sr.'s administration. Prior to that, she was with Monsanto. And prior to that, she was with the EPA. She's been back and forth 3 times. And the list goes on and on like that in Washington. I have written a letter to our Attorney General, John Ashcroft, and I begged him for help with this monumental crisis that farmers are facing and we're facing. His response was that it is not their policy to get involved in private litigation matters. I have since learned that Mr. John Ashcroft has submitted a brief to the U.S. Supreme Court regarding a similar patent infringement case to be heard in October. He preyed upon the Supreme Court to uphold these new plant patents to protect the corporations that own the patents. Upon learning this, I also learned that Mr. Ashcroft had received the largest campaign contribution that Monsanto gave any 2000 political candidate in his failed bid for Senate re-election.
"20 years since GM first hit our markets. The promises of early research remain unfulfilled. Roundup-ready technology dominates the GM market in America, and now the story of seed would return to the courtroom as the full implications of patent law became clear to the world."
And I'll never forget when my wife and I left our door here, the front door. My wife turned around and said, "I hope to God I have a roof over my house, over my head tonight when I come home." That's how close we were to lose everything. We had put everything on the line. And I feel sorry for the farmers that didn't have that opportunity and have lost their farms, hundreds of them.
Canadian farmer Percy Schmeiser had been growing canola, saving and breeding the seed, for 50 years. But in 1998, some of his seed was found to contain the patented Roundup Ready gene.
Whether it's seeds blown in from your neighbor's field, pollen flow by the wind, or from bees, if that happens to you, you no longer own your seeds to plants. They immediately, under patent law, become the ownership of the corporation.
Percy was taken to the Canadian Federal Court for patent infringement. His defense, that the GM presence was accidental, was rejected by the court, and in 2000 he was found guilty.
They had no record of us ever obtaining their seeds or buying their seed, but they said because our neighbor grew it and contaminated us, we should not have been using their seed. We ought to should have known. Well, that's completely impossible. A canola seed, whether it's genetic altered or not, or organic, it's identically the same unless you do DNA testing.
To date, over 140 US farmers have been prosecuted for the infringement of intellectual property over seeds. Thousands more have been investigated for so-called seed piracy.
What are we supposed to do with seeds? Seeds are supposed to be planted, multiplied, used, further adapted, etc., etc. That's exactly what's not allowed from the corporate mindset. The corporations sell us the seed or license us to use the seed in a specific way, in the way they are interested to use it. Full stop.
By controlling the seed, you control the farmer. By controlling the farmer, you control the whole food system. And that's the legacy of genetics in farming.
Today, the GM market has spread beyond North America and established itself in Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, and now in India. Whilst the GM industry claims to be increasing yields and improving lives, more and more farmers are reporting new and unexpected problems. In the Indian state of Gujarat, hundreds of thousands of farmers persuaded to grow genetically modified Bt cotton, a crop which produces its own pesticide, found that in time the pests developed their own resistance to the crop. The rise of these superpests has forced the farmers to use ever stronger pesticides.
Instead of controlling pests and controlling weeds, you are getting superpests and superweeds. So even in the narrow domain of weed control and pest control, the technology is failing.
With the rising cost of seeds, fertilizers and pesticides, many farmers have been forced into a spiral of debt, and the spread of GM cotton has been linked to a tragic increase of suicides among Indian farmers. In Argentina, thousands of small farmers have been forced to leave their land, unable to compete economically with highly mechanized monocrop farms. Many non-GM farmers have found it impossible to avoid the Roundup herbicide blowing in from neighbors' land and see their crops and their livelihoods perish. And with the mass exodus of farmers from their land, farm biodiversity has decreased still further. Traditional crops have been replaced. Herbicide use has risen dramatically, and hard-learned knowledge and farming systems have been elbowed aside.
With the loss of diversity, you lose your security, because that diversity is synonymous with security. It also means improved livelihood, it means improved nutrition, it means improved division of labor. All this would be lost to one crop.
We have to realize that diversity means survival. Diversity means being able to continue to produce, being able to continue to be a farmer. And without that, I think it's very important to realize that we're simply not being able, we will not be able to produce the food we need if we allow that this kind of diversity is further eroded.
For instance, if you wanted to go to a chemist and say, look, I want to have a chemical, say a pesticide, which will persist throughout the food chain, and I don't want it to have to renew it very, very often. I'd like it to be relatively non-destructible. And then he'd put 2 benzene molecules on the blackboard and add a chlorine here and a chlorine that, and that was DDT.
When the 8th Army needed Jap civilians to help them out in our occupation, they called on native doctors to administer DDT under the supervision of our men to stem a potential typhus epidemic. Dusting like this goes a long way in checking disease, and the laughs on them. Pardon our dust.
As the petrochemical era grew and grew, warning signs emerged that some of these chemicals could pose hazards. The data initially were trivial, anecdotal, but gradually a body of data started accumulating to the extent that we now know that the synthetic chemicals which have permeated our workplace, our consumer products, our air, our water, produce cancer and also birth defects and some other toxic effects. Furthermore, industry has known about this, at least most industries have known about this, and have attempted to trivialize these risks. Towards the end of 1989, a great box of documents arrived at my office without any indication where they came from. And I opened them and found in it a complete set of Monsanto files, particularly a set of files dealing with toxicological testing of cows who've been given RBGH.
BST, trade name Posilac, is being used in more than a quarter of the dairy herds in the United States, according to Monsanto. The milk has been drunk by a large portion of the American population since the Food and Drug Administration declared it safe for both cows and humans 4 years ago.
And at that time, Monsanto was saying, there's no evidence whatsoever of any adverse effects, we don't use antibiotics, and this clearly showed that they had lied through their teeth. The files described areas of chronic inflammation in the heart, lung, kidney, spleen, also reproductive effects, also a whole series of other problems.
The most comprehensive independent assessment of the drug concludes that BST results in unnecessary pain, suffering and distress for the cows. This is not acceptable for a drug designed simply to increase milk production.
It is a silly product. The industrial world is awash in milk. We're overproducing milk. We actually have governments around the world who pay farmers not to produce milk. So the first product Monsanto comes up with is a product that produces more of what we don't need.
Of course, you'll want to inject Posilac to every eligible cow, as each cow not treated is a lost income opportunity.
But the problem was that use of the artificial hormone caused all kinds of problems for the cows. It caused something called mastitis, which is a very painful infection of the udders. When you milk the cow, if the cow has bad mastitis, some of the, and I don't know how to say this in a, I hope people aren't watching at dinner time, but the pus from the infection of the udders ends up in the milk, and the somatic cell count, they call it, the bacteria count inside your milk goes up.
There's a cost to the cows. The cows get sicker when they're injected with RBGH. They're injected with antibiotics. We know that people are consuming antibiotics through their food. And we know that that's contributing to antibiotic-resistant bacteria and diseases. And we know we're at a crisis when somebody can go into a hospital and get a staph infection and it can't be cured and they die. That's a crisis.
Bad for the cow, bad for the farmer, bad potentially for the consumer. The jury is out. We see a lot of conflicting evidence about potential health risks. And of course, as a consumer, my belief is, why should I take any risk?
Consider milk, the traditional symbol of purity and nutrition, especially for children. But some milk has undergone a radical change. It's not the same wholesome milk our grandparents drank, and many experts believe this altered milk is leading to cancer and other serious problems. The altered dairy products were introduced in 1994 when farmers started injecting their cows with RBGH.
RBGH stands for recombinant bovine growth hormone, which means genetically engineered bovine growth hormone. RBGH is also known as RBST. It's the same thing. It is a genetically engineered hormone developed to force cows to produce more milk, typically 5 to 15% more milk.
It speeds up their metabolism, where they will eat more feed and they'll give more milk.
Jeffrey Smith is an international best-selling author and expert on the health risks of genetically engineered foods.
Nearly 1 out of every 6 dairy cows in the United States are injected with this pharmaceutical drug, which critics call crack for cows. Studies show that it decreases the nutritional content while it increases the amount of antibiotics, the amount of hormones, and the amount of pus. It's marketed by Monsanto under the brand name Posilac, and they want more cows in this stuff.
Of course, you'll want to inject Posilac to every eligible cow, as each cow not treated is a lost income opportunity.
To make RBGH, scientists take genes from cows and insert them into E. coli bacteria. The new genetically engineered E. coli then produces the cow's hormone. Bovine growth hormone stimulates another powerful hormone called IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1. The milk from treated cows has much higher levels of IGF-1, and that's a big problem.
But we at Oregon PSR believe in the science, and there is enough scientific data that points to a concern for increased cancer rates in humans. RBGH increases the IGF-1 in cow's milk, and this is not disputed. It's also not disputed that elevated levels of IGF-1 can promote cancer in humans.
A Harvard study showed that men with high levels of IGF-1 are 4 times more likely to develop prostate cancer. Premenopausal women are 7 times more likely to develop breast cancer. It's implicated in lung and colon cancer. And a recent study implicated IGF-1 in a higher rate of fraternal twins. In fact, in the United States, we have twice the rate of increase of fraternal twins than in the UK, where RBGH is banned. In addition to more IGF-1 in the milk, there's also more bovine growth hormone. Now, the researchers claim that this hormone was largely destroyed during pasteurization, but it turns out they pasteurized the milk 120 times longer than normal. The drug also increases an infection, a painful infection in the udder called mastitis, and this in turn increases the amount of pus in the milk.
Because of the mastitis, dairy farmers use more antibiotics, and this cannot help but increase antibiotic resistance in humans, which is a major increasing health problem.
So, for example, if you drank milk that had residues of erythromycin in it, then bacteria in your stomach could pick up resistance to that erythromycin, so that if you came down with an illness, you wouldn't be able to use erythromycin to treat it.
The FDA doesn't require labels on dairy products from cows treated with RBGH. In fact, Monsanto sued dairies that labeled their products as RBGH-free. In 2003, for example, Monsanto sued Oakhurst Dairy for labeling on their carton no artificial hormones. Oakhurst had to settle with Monsanto by including a disclaimer sentence on their carton which said, FDA states no significant difference in milk from cows treated with artificial hormones.
Several organizations have been educating consumers about the health risks of RBGH, and it's having a profound impact.
Company after company is going RBGH free in response to consumer demand. RBGH is a house of cards, and the foundation of RBGH is consumer ignorance, because once consumers find out about the problems associated with this hormone, then they don't want to have anything to do with it, and they vote with their dollars and start buying RBGH free products.
America, bountiful, innovative, entrepreneurial, diverse, progressive, sick, Americans get sick more often than Europeans and people in other industrialized countries, and they're getting sicker. Since the mid-90s, the number of Americans suffering from at least 3 chronic illnesses nearly doubled, and America's international ranking for infant mortality and lifespan also plunged. There are many reasons why this is taking place. One may be right in front of you.
Over the past 20 years, there's been an almost logarithmic increase in a whole series of chronic illnesses.
The things we're seeing today aren't normal. We didn't see them 30 years ago or 50 years ago.
Illnesses that weren't epidemic before are now epidemic. And at a scale it is just monumental.
People are getting sicker. What's changed? Well, one thing that's changed is the food. And the most radical change is the genetic engineering of our food supply.
We have gone from food in its whole food form to food undergoing a scientific experiment.
We have hundreds of millions of acres of genetically modified crops that have been planted in the United States, and yet most people are not aware.
Obama's USDA is owned by the biotech just as much as every previous administration. And if we don't do anything, like within a decade, every single major crop with any significant market size is going to be genetically modified, and we're not going to know it.
You know, all I can say is it's not nice to fool Mother Nature, and it's not right for biotech and food companies to fool and deceive the American people.
We need to start having conversations in our communities, our cities, neighborhoods, whatever it is it takes to get involved with our local food movements.
You know, this is serious, and it's not only our right to know, but it's our right to complain.
Let food be thy medicine.
As I said, I mean, this is the issue of the moment.
This is insane. It violates people's rights. It violates basic principles of a marketplace where you have to have information to make decisions. And it's dangerous because the studies that have been done show a lot of health effects.
I can tell you right now that 85% of the corn in the United States is genetically modified.
Stop letting Monsanto and DuPont and all these other companies, stop letting them maintain intellectual property monopolies over the seeds that were granted by Mother Nature and God and the universe so that we can sustain life on this planet. That's what it's really about.
Off the sidewalks into the streets!
to know what they're eating. Most people do think that they have the right, but those rights will never be upheld as long as corporations can spend unlimited amounts of money to influence the outcomes of elections.
They have no right to mess with our food. You don't turn food into a lab experiment.
Demonstrations against